This is Roadmap to Resilience, an audio series for professionals and families who are supporting children experiencing stress and trauma. I'm Dr. Julian Ford.
And I'm Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. Whether you work with children or you have children of your own, this podcast is for you.
Last episode, we learned about trauma, what it is and how it affects children. And this time, we're going to take a look at the other side of the coin, and that is resilience. When trauma occurs, resilience is what enables a child or a family to get through the adversity and carry on with their lives. So it's not a cure for trauma, and it doesn't heal the visible or invisible wounds of trauma, but resilience really plays a crucial role in a recovery from trauma.
So it's when, despite this, they're not only able to survive, but also thrive. That's resilience.
It can be really helpful to think of resilience as a way of resetting after trauma. It's literally life-saving for a child who might otherwise be so fearful or depressed or maybe so angry and alienated that they just give up on life or live in a constant state of fighting back against the world. So resilience doesn't make the hurt or the anger go away, but it really enables kids who've been traumatized and families to keep living and not have to keep reliving the trauma.
So resilience takes a lot of strength and courage, and the creativity and resourcefulness to find a path forward in life that isn't blocked off or reduced to merely surviving. And so those abilities don't just come from the child alone, because the support of people like parents or other caregivers who care and value that child. They also provide safety and security. These are essential ingredients in children's resilience after trauma.
Clearly, resilience after trauma is just as complex as trauma. So in this episode, we're going to hear from several experts on their opinions about children's and families' resilience, what it is, where it comes from, and how it actually makes a difference. First, we're going to hear from Karen Zilberstein, who is a licensed clinical social worker and a practicing psychotherapist. She's also the clinical director of the Northampton, Massachusetts chapter of A Home Within.
Children continue to amaze me all the time. I'm thinking in particular of one who was really, really shut down and avoidant after being terribly, terribly abused and traumatized in her early years, and spent years and years feeling overwhelmed by the world, sensory and all these other ways, and found a few outlets. And the one that was the most meaningful, that really helped get her on track, was taking care of dogs, and started to look up about rescue dogs, dogs that needed to be rescued, and to think about how she could help others who had also had traumatized. And it started with animals. And then that started to build a sense of confidence and a sense of connection and a sense of trust that then could extend to people in a really nice way, and got her out of her shell. Things that give you a sense of control, of purpose, are really, really powerful. So resilience is being able to thrive as well as you can, despite the circumstances.
So the example we just heard from Karen really shows us how kids can find a purpose or a sense of meaning and mastery through an activity we might consider to be pretty ordinary. That child had the ability to recognize what she needed and find a creative way to get that need met.
So isn't it fascinating to see that when children are recovering from trauma, they're not just getting over something terrible that happened to them. They are doing that. But in addition, they're discovering aspects of themselves and ways of being in the world that they might not have ever realized. And this little girl shows us very clearly that by bonding with that animal and being able to care for that animal, she was able to develop a sense of competence, being able to actually trust in a relationship. And we hope that she probably was able to extend that to many other relationships. And that's how children develop resilience. They start with what's most basic and what's right in their lives. And from that, they rebuild their lives.
So clearly resilience involves more than just grit and toughness. And how we help children build these skills is a huge focus for child healthcare professionals of all sorts. That includes pediatricians like Dr. Brooks Keeshin of the University of Utah and Primary Children's Hospital Center for Safe and Healthy Families. Dr. Keeshin talks here about the more clinical applications of resilience.
resilience is pediatrics in a lot of ways. The pediatrician, at her core or his core, is responsible for recognizing that there's a lot of variation with illness, there's a lot of variation with development, and then occasionally there's really bad developmental changes, or there's really bad illnesses, and we need to sound the alarm. And so that pediatrician is always going back and forth between, can I write this off as a normal variation in development and reassure the family and give them some supports and keep them going in that direction? Or do I need to sound the alarm? Just like, can I keep this kid here in the clinic and we can, give them a nebulizer or something for their breathing issues versus I need to get this kid the ED. Like that's the world that pediatricians live in. And so, we're naturally inclined to be looking for those opportunities of fostering resilience. Something scary happened. This very difficult episode happened. What are the ways in which, we can look at little Jimmy's behaviors and say, these are normal, natural, understandable reactions to having gone through something like that? And what are the things that we can do within your family, or maybe with a little bit of help in the community or with a therapist to kind of help get Jimmy feeling back to where he was feeling before and thinking about positive things and doing well in school. And I'm here for you. So I think that's the resiliency, like the strength of pediatrics is really, it is very resiliency focused. And at the same time, they need to be entrusted with being able to say, we wanted to kind of look at this as a resilient episode, and we're not back to where we need to be, or based on what's going on, in addition to promoting resilience, we need all these other supports as well. I think that's the role that pediatricians play, and it really it's no different than their natural normal role of kind of trying to fit kids into healthy or explainable, and we're going to get through this categories, but then identifying those really at-risk kids who really need services and they need them now. All of us pediatricians feel like we are so privileged to be able to interact with families at that period because of the potential for change.
Pediatric healthcare professionals like Dr. Keeshin really have a unique perspective on children's experience of both trauma and resilience. I mean, they see children at their best and at times when children and families are having extreme difficulties. And through their caring for children and guidance for parents, they can play a crucial role in identifying children who are impacted by trauma. And they also provide enormous support for parents and children to bolster their resilience when they're recovering from trauma.
Dr. Keeshin mentioned social supports or community supports, and that can also make a profound difference in children's lives. You're going to hear lots of examples of these types of creative community efforts throughout this series, including this example from Dr. Apryl Alexander, who is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at the University of Denver.
Yeah, I think it's going to some of the non-Western models. If we go back to kind of indigenous practices and practices from Asian cultures of collective care, I think with everything that happened in this last year and a half, I was still so excited and still so hopeful because communities did engage in collective care. They might not name it and know it, but they did. Mm-hmm. So when the stay-at-home order hit, our schools closed down and we went to online learning. Well, let's think about our kids in school. How many received their only meals at school? Their breakfast and lunch being their only meals of the day, they were receiving that at school. So I saw quickly our community here, and I'm sure communities all over the place said, oh my gosh, we need to deliver or have pickup for breakfast and lunch for these youth. Again, addressing that issue of food insecurity. That was collective action. That was collective resilience that was so powerful, and they did it so quickly. Even the silly things, okay, we have to physically distance, but can we have the car parades for people's birthdays in communities? And seeing that, I participated in a few. Can we have, at my university, we had online dance parties for families across the country just to connect, and grandparents were showing up to see their grandkids on these daily dance parties. That was collective care and resilience that I think, again, I hope moving forward, we don't take for granted that communities can come together, know what their needs are, and figure out ways to support one another. Fundraising, again, up last year. So there are so many ways that we just kick into gear and engage in that collective action that we really need to center and think about how we are supporting and caring for each other. Again, I think it's a lot of marginalized communities who do that very quickly. And so, when we're talking about next time we have a natural disaster, next time we have a pandemic, how can we start that earlier? How can we hold our bigger systems and our governments accountable for implementing that type of collective care? Again, I think there is some heart in it that communities are leading it, but I think there's ways we can improve that going forward.
There's nothing more valuable than that consistent caring adult throughout this process.
That was Dr. Bianca Harper, who's a clinical associate professor at the Arizona State University School of Social Work.
And that's even something for us to think about as interdisciplinary teams. So certainly not, that's important with the family system and with, mental health professionals and, for everyone involved, but just thinking about being really mindful of how do we make sure that there is somebody consistently there for that child. I think that really is important for fostering resilience. How robust is their support system? How consistent are those individuals within their support system? So certainly looking at, with their kind of circle of, influence, so their families, friends, other adults, in their communities, community providers, right? All of us can really promote and have a positive impact on resilience occurring. And then I think the other piece is, do they have the skills to cope, and do they utilize those coping skills consistently? I think both on an individual level and a collective level in terms of the family system, all of that's really critical for really promoting resilience. And I also just think a lot about, developmental asset building, which ties into all of these, right? So really thinking about those internal assets that child or adolescent can develop in terms of skills, they're developing those values and self-perceptions that really promote resilience. And then those external assets, which I was mentioning around the support systems and those really solid relationships and just opportunities for growth, those opportunities to be successful in ways that are important to them. I think all of that really promotes resilience.
Dr. Harper presents more of a multi-tiered approach by building resilience in a few different avenues at once. So she talks about families playing a crucial role in children's resilience by providing them with safety and security. And we know that is essential for recovering from trauma.
She also mentioned developmental assets. These are the experiences and resources that enable children to develop healthy lives despite experiencing trauma. These assets are things like the availability of a caring adult who reinforces a child's sense of worth, who also provides a model for the values that sustain children when they are developing.
Dr. Harper also mentioned community support. And as we were talking about previously, community support is a really important ingredient in maximizing the way families function and developmental progress.
So when we have adults in our lives who recognize and affirm our humanity and dignity, this can make all the difference in a person's ability to build and sustain resilience. It could be an acquaintance or even a stranger. So here's a powerful example from Dr. Claudette Antuña, a licensed psychologist who specializes in supporting immigrant communities.
The resilience of people, what they've gone through to get here, and then what they go through when they're here is incredible. I have I remember a young woman who was raped, tortured, and beaten. And then when they finished with her, they threw her out naked into the street. She covered herself in her own way. And she said, the first person that came around was a man on a motorcycle, saw her, and just told her to get in the back. Her nakedness did not matter to him. And she was able to see that she needed help. He could offer the help. And that was what was important to him. And that's what gave her a sense of respect, a sense of, I am a person that needed help and he was willing to give it to me. And he just, that made all the difference in the world. And it was someone that didn't know her at all and took her down about an hour away from her to where she needed to go. That humanized the experience. She realized that not every man in the world is going to torture and rape her, but that there are men who are willing to help her. And she was traumatized. I mean, she still had flashbacks and nightmares of it, but it lessened as soon as someone can offer you a humanizing event. It seems to be able to gain some equilibrium for her. At least it did for her. And for others, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. What a powerful description of trauma and then resilience.
Resilience.
And resilience with just that little but crucial support.
Yeah. But it's being able to recognize that that's what it was, in her, that she was able to identify that that was what was happening, that there was someone who was offering her help because she was a fellow human being, not because she was a naked woman, but it was a fellow human being.
Moments of shared humanity like this, even from strangers, even under dire circumstances, are crucial for building resilience. And I think that example was a really good reminder that we all have a responsibility to support the dignity of everyone in our communities.
And as pediatric psychologist Dr. Sandra Rafman points out in the next clip, resilience does not mean that a person will automatically bounce back from trauma or that they don't need and deserve help when recovering from trauma.
I hate the word resilience.
Say it.
I mean,
why?
No, because sometimes I don't like the way it's used. Like a child suffers. So you say, oh, don't worry, kids are resilient. It's like another way of like protecting us from the pain of seeing their pain. Like it's another way of not dealing with it or silencing the pain. And that's obviously not always true, but it's also like it has its whatever definitional issues, but I just don't want it misused, put it
right,
that way.
Like a crutch or an easy out because we just dismiss it. Right.
Like, don't worry, they're resilient. Don't worry, they're resilient.
That's exactly why we're doing this series, I think, because Julian and I were also frustrated with the assumption that the kids will just be fine. And so let's bring together all of these people to really talk about what makes them fine and the work we need to do to help them.
Just because kids are resilient doesn't mean that they don't suffer.
Right.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that they don't need our protection and our care.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have an example that comes to my mind, and it's a very old example from the time in which I was working at one of the public agencies, actually the child abuse program. Mm. One of our jobs was to assess sexual abuse allegations. We were court ordered to do these assessments. At that time, the place where I was working was less than a place, was kind of working in the middle of the street. You know, when you go to a place where there has been a catastrophe and you can't have your office, but you have to sit probably in a hallway in between two places. Well, that was the place in which I used to work. We didn't have offices. We had boxes, and the boxes were divided by this folding screens. There were no walls. There was no heat. So in winter, you could freeze to death. It was like being outside or inside, it was the same temperature. So the places were far from being private, and we're far from being private to talk about what happened to your body. So I recall this boy, I think he was 8 years old, probably. I'm talking about 20 years ago. Yet I still remember this image because it was very powerful. And he wanted us to be sitting on the floor under the desk because he felt more protected there. So I was there with my coat on, with a scarf, freezing, not knowing how I will be able to write because my fingers were just frozen. And at some point he was starting to talk to me and he said, wait. He took off his coat and put it in a huge hole between the folding screen and the floor. And he said, because someone can listen to us. And I said, my goodness, I really felt ashamed because I said, we are surrounded and everyone can hear everything from everywhere. But he found this hole, and for him, just covering this hole was enough. I cannot tell him, don't worry, because everyone is going to listen to us. And he's able to disconnect from these hostile surroundings. And he has seen me only once before. I'm a complete unknown person in a very hostile place, and he still wants to tell me what his father did to him. This is resilience. Once I decide to tell someone what happened to me, and I can find something that I cannot explain what is it, but I feel like she's going to listen to me, the child moves on. And for a child to do this in the middle of this hostile environment, facing all the threats, he doesn't know what is going to happen if he talks to me. What he knows is that his father told him, you cannot talk. And he's doing it. He's talking to a complete stranger. This is resilience.
That heartbreaking story was from Dr. Sandra Baita, clinical psychologist and child therapist. I've thought about this story so many times since I first heard her tell it. And it's one of those examples that I think really just stays with you. The way that that little boy was able to essentially, get his needs met, do something to control one little aspect of his environment to try to introduce safety and a space where he could really unpack some of the things that happened with her. It was just such a beautiful example of a tiny little way a child can show their resilience and take steps to try to increase it.
Yes, it's just incredible when we hear about the amazing resourcefulness that children have and the ways that they can find some sense of safety, security, and some way of having some control in their lives when maybe much is beyond their control. It's just so powerful to hear that. And I think it reminds us that that's exactly what we need to provide ways to support so that children can tap into those inner well springs of resilience that are so profound.
Exactly. And part of what I think is so significant there is that, Dr. Baita didn't expect that little boy to do it on his own, right? She was creating space and opportunity and time for him to really explore what he was able to do in those moments and what he wasn't. So kids can come out on the other side of traumatic experiences in lots of different ways, right? They sort of emerge from that surviving in whatever ways they can. But what I think we're really trying to emphasize here is that they shouldn't have to do it alone. We can't just assume that children will bounce back. Instead, we have to take steps to make deliberate interventions as caregivers, as mental health professionals, as community members, as healthcare professionals. It's all of our responsibility to provide the structure that children need to feel safe enough to heal.
I think this is a great example that just reminds us that we're all in this together. And what we can do to support children in finding paths to resilience and recovery. It's something that you don't have to be a therapist to do that. You don't have to be a healthcare professional. Those of us who are privileged to have those roles can provide particular kinds of support, but it can come from anywhere and everywhere in the community. And it does really just require that kind of safe space that Dr. Baita's example provided.
So there are lots of things that we can do to support kids and also to continue to do our own work to build our own resilience. Because in many ways, we are of no service to kids who need our support if we ourselves aren't continuing to strengthen our resiliency. So we should be caring for ourselves, both as an example to children who need our support, but also to lift responsibility from the very children we're trying to care for. So Dr. Archana Basu, clinical psychologist and instructor in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, discusses here the importance of adults building their own resilience to enable them to support the children in their lives.
I think actually one of the most important things and powerful things that we are actually not that great at as caregivers is to get help and support for ourselves. So I think one of the main things that I have learned about myself, but I always suspect it is true, and we know this from research and just human experiences, as caregivers, we think about our kids first. We might be caring for elderly parents. We have jobs to keep, but our own health and well-being is often right at the bottom of that priority list. But in fact, supporting kids is about building the resilience of the parents and the consistent caregivers, the people who care for kids, especially for young kids. So responsive relationships build resilience. And for me, that means parents getting their own sort of mental health care if they need it, or building practices that support their own well-being is really, really key. Before children can regulate, we help to co-regulate, and that sort of builds on our capacity to regulate ourselves. And so I think thinking about our own histories and our relationship with ourselves, including kind of some of the judgments that come inherent in parental guilt, all of that plays a role. Thinking about what our needs are, even though that feels selfish or even maybe contradictory to what our goal is in terms of supporting kids, is actually one of the most important starting points. If there's nothing else we take away from this, I would say parents investing in themselves, even though that's a challenge, is very, very important.
Being a parent is not easy. I know that. I'm a parent as well as a psychologist. And I also know that it's easy to forget about myself when I'm thinking about taking care of others. And I realize that for most parents, their children come first. And that's a wonderful thing. But children look to their parents not only for safety, security, protection, and the good things in life, but they also look to them for examples. And if what kids see are parents who are not taking care of themselves and who are stressed out and not getting help and not taking breaks and not doing the things that are healthy for them in their lives, that's what kids are going to follow as their example. You know, there's that saying about first, when you have to put on your oxygen mask in an airplane, if there's an emergency, you got to put yours on first, and then you help your kids or other passengers put on theirs. We as parents and professionals have to be careful that we're always remembering to put on our oxygen mask by taking care of ourselves while we help build the resilience that we want to support in children and families.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the things also as a parent that I've struggled a lot with myself. And I know so many other parents have too. Like, when do you fit in that time to take care of yourself? And sometimes it even might feel selfish, or you might feel, really bad at it. And it just can kind of lead to even more negative self-talk and guilt around something else you're not doing well as a parent. But I've tried to really shift my thinking over time that, exactly like you were saying, Julian, this is a part of my job as a parent. It's one of the many parts of my job as a parent, is to take care of myself, because I am of no use to my kids if I am not myself, healthy and in good space to meet their needs. So I think about the importance of the ways that Dr. Basu was talking about we co-regulate each other in our homes, that they are watching us all the time and pick up on so much more than I think we tend to give our kids credit for. And so because of that, the ways that we're modeling things like, taking care of ourselves, getting outside, getting enough exercise, regulating our own emotions, taking timeouts when we need them. They're watching all of those things as examples. And I just think that we really can't emphasize enough Dr. Basu's point about how important it is for parents to really try to center themselves as much as they center their kids.
That's such a great example, Amanda. And, it really helps me to hear that too, because that's a perfect example of co-regulation. What you were just saying gave me something to think about and gave me a moment to take a pause and take a deep breath. And I hope that all of our listeners are doing exactly the same thing right now for themselves, and then passing that on to their children and the families who they work with or care for. So to sum up, a key theme seems to be that building resilience takes a village, and we're all playing a crucial role in supporting children in that village as they tap into their amazing capacities for resilience.
Yeah, and after listening to all these different definitions and applications of resilience, we really encourage you to stay open to different examples and perspectives on this concept of resilience and what it looks like. We're going to keep exploring this term and what it means in more depth throughout the series. But really, our goal is to keep our understanding of resilience as down to earth and practical as possible. How do we help children who have experienced trauma bounce forward? What do we need to do to support them? And how can that look different for kids in different circumstances?
So we're really taking a very different approach to thinking about children's experience of trauma. Instead of focusing on all of the terrible aspects, which we need to pay attention to, we're focusing really on the recovery, the bouncing forward, as Amanda said. And that's something that we're going to continue to explore through every episode as we go forward in this series.
Many thanks to our guests on this episode, Dr. Apryl Alexander, Dr. Claudette Antuña, Dr. Sandra Baita, Dr. Archana Basu, Dr. Bianca Harper, Dr. Brooks Keeshin, Dr. Sandra Rafman, and Karen Zilberstein.
Visit roadmaptoresilience.org to learn more about our guest experts, access additional videos and resources, or send us a message.
If this episode piqued your interest, we'd love for you to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and let us know what you think. And if you imagine this episode would resonate with a colleague or friend, please share it.
Roadmap to Resilience is a collaboration between Pandemic Parenting and the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, with special thanks to the Interorganizational Child Trauma Task Force.
Roadmap to Resilience is produced by my co-hosts, Dr. Julian Ford, myself, Dr. Amanda Zelahusky, along with Carmen Vincent and Victoria Bruick. Many thanks to Jennifer Valentine for her strategic support, and to the teams at Pandemic Parenting and the Center for the Treatment of Developmental Trauma Disorders for providing promotional support.
We'd also like to thank the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's National Child Traumatic Stress Network for their financial support of this project.
Thank you for joining us in supporting children in need of a roadmap to resilience.